Young men have the power to achieve great things in their lives. A lot of us grow up dreaming about being great, but as we get older, these dreams seem to fade away. Something about growing from a boy to a man just changes the way we see life. It changes the way we see our dreams. It feels like something is missing, especially in today's day, with a bunch of people telling you to do this, to do that, to live this way, and to pick up this new habit. There's so much conflicting advice, and it's very hard for young guys to truly find their way. You could look to the past and find many young people with dreams and aspirations to become something great, despite the adversity that they knew they would inevitably face in the pursuit of that dream. I think I speak for many young men watching this video when I say that life lately feels lonely. And by lately, I kind of mean as soon as you really graduate high school, life starts to get a little more isolated. Probably the biggest thing that plagues us today as a society, especially as young men, is a feeling within us that needs desperate fixing, but we just don't know what the right tools for the job are. That feeling I'm talking about is the odd, ever so ominous feeling of loneliness. But it's hard to even describe it as loneliness, because as empty as we sometimes feel, most of us tend to have a lot of great friends in our lives. Even despite that fact, we still kind of feel like something is missing inside. Loneliness is extremely powerful and is what pushes some people into complete nihilism, which is of course one of the routes to take. But through the pursuit of something great in life, loneliness can be overcome. If this introduction kind of resonated with you, then I'd highly recommend giving the manga The Climber or Kokou no Hito a read. This manga has a lot to do with loneliness, but it's a true story following the story of the climber Mori Buntarou, who in the manga is actually known as Mori Buntarou for a lot of the story. I never considered how a manga could take the concept of loneliness and execute it in the way that the climber did. Stories like Berserk and Vagabond have their own kinds of mental battles, and they sort of deal with loneliness. I mean, Guts and Musashi end up pretty much being lonely for a lot of the story, but it doesn't really take it as a main driving theme of the story like the climber does. And that's what I would say sets it apart from a lot of other manga, alongside what I will get into later, which is the incredible amount of symbolism and of course the character development of Mori Buntarou, which character development being one of the most important aspects of these kinds of manga, these seinen manga. Again, if you like Berserk, Vagabond, and mostly any of these other seinen series that likes to implement the human condition and what humans suffer through into their storytelling, specifically with the pain of loneliness, if it's something that kind of resonates with you, how to actually overcome it being another thing, all of this is very, very well depicted in the series Kokou no Hito. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's going through this, even to anyone who's not really going through this, who may have experienced this at some point throughout their lives, or maybe you just haven't even dealt with loneliness. Maybe your life has just been great, you've been grateful for everything, and you've lived through it perfectly fine. I still think this manga teaches you things that will come in handy in the future at some point. So Kokou no Hito, or The Climber, is a manga that was originally published by Shinichi Sakamoto in November of 2007, and it aired for almost 4 years, spanning 17 volumes and 170 chapters. This is actually very fast considering the detail and the artwork and the symbolism that seems to be present in almost every chapter. Like I kind of hinted at a few minutes ago, the symbolism in this manga is next to none in my opinion. Like there are very few things that I would say are the best in manga, especially when I hold Berserk and Vagabond to such a high degree. But I will genuinely say that the symbolism in The Climber is easily the best I've ever seen. Like truly, if you can really get some of the symbolism that it tries to put out there, you'll be far more impressed with the storytelling and the way that these authors were able to combine it into a story in such a short time. I mean, 4 years. If you're a Berserk fan, 4 years sounds like 10 chapters at very best, let alone 170 with almost the same complexity in artwork and storytelling. That is something that needs to be recognized. What's interesting about this manga is that Sakamoto is not the only author who worked on it. In fact, it has been passed down to authors such as Yoshiro Nabeda, Hiroshi Takano, and the manga itself was actually based on a novel by Jirou Nitta. So a lot of people have worked on this manga, and one of the criticisms I hear is that it kind of feels like it's being passed on to different people. Like there are different points in the story where you can tell that there are different authors working on it because the story and the characters seem to be expressed differently. I didn't quite get that. There were some instances where things felt a little rushed and a little weird, and that's probably my main criticism with the story, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Just to say that a story like this was able to have been created by multiple authors during its run and still come to a great conclusion like it did is truly impressive to me. I actually completed this manga a day before writing this script since I need to get all my thoughts down before I forget, because there's a lot to talk about. It's not just like, oh, this manga is incredible like I say in every one of my review videos. I genuinely wanted to sit down, have like somewhat of a script, and actually talk about why I love this manga so much. Loneliness is something I've battled with. I feel like I've battled with it, and I say I feel like because it's still so weird to me how I can know and love so many incredibly genuine people in my life but still feel some sort of emptiness. Like, I've talked about this with a few friends and they express the same sort of feeling as me. We don't really know what it is. It's mainly been in the last year where I encountered this kind of odd emptiness from time to time, and I would just not know how to get rid of it. And I'm sure if you're a young man watching this video who has aspirations other than reading and complaining about Japanese comics, you'll know what I'm talking about, at least a little bit. I mean, even if it's just a little, I feel like most young guys have this feeling. The truth is, as we grow up, we tend to lose our sense of passion and our childish dreams. That's kind of why the world seems to lose color and vibrance as we grow into our late teens and into early adulthood. And I feel like part of this is obviously due to the demands of society. Things like work and school lead to addictions and social media being a big part of our lives. But I feel like it's mainly due to the one core concept that I don't think many people are talking about, and it's that we need to keep dreaming. If there's one thing, and certainly only one thing, that you should take out of Griffith's book, it's to dream big and set high aspirations, because at times of depression and at times of being at the lowest point in your life, it can often be these dreams and these goals and these passions that we've had at some point that really pull us out of the hole and allow us to climb up to where we really want to be. The protagonist of Kokou no Hito, Mori Buntarou, as I mentioned, is probably the most isolated main character I've ever seen. He has a good reason to be, because it seems like everywhere he goes, tragedy occurs. Now, Mori kind of lives as an outcast. He isolates himself from everyone around him willingly. Even though people try to lend him a helping hand, he kind of just rejects everybody and tries to be on his own. His life is empty and meaningless, and it's kind of like what some of us are right now, but it's a lot more exaggerated, I feel like. He won't even make any attempts to talk. He ignores people, to the point where, as a reader, in my opinion, actually, it really just got annoying, if I'm being honest. Like, I just wanted to go through the screen and tell this man to wake up and just make some friends, but he just would not do that. He joins another school in the first chapter, where he's almost immediately thrown into a situation involving climbing, where one of his classmates, Miyamoto, walks up to him on the roof of the school with his climbing gear on in the middle of class and asks him to climb. Mori says he'll do it on the condition that Miyamoto rightfully shuts the fuck up, and so Mori begins to climb, and the entire school is staring at this kid because he's not even wearing any climbing gear. Think about it. This dude is about to climb a building that's probably like at least 10 stories high, and he's not wearing any climbing gear. So you can tell that he pretty much doesn't give two shits about living. But as Mori nearly climbs to the top, which alone is quite the accomplishment, he reaches this massive overhang. What's interesting here that happens is that Mori has no passion or no reason to get over this obstacle, as pretty much everyone around the school is freaking out. Even Miyamoto himself, the guy who told Mori to climb this high, did not expect him to get this high. And so Mori's best option in a situation like this, where he kind of doesn't care about anything, you'd think he'd just like slowly come down, maybe even jump off if he's really feeling suicidal. But what Mori does is something out of the blue, and I feel like this really highlights these subtle moments in our lives that kind of change everything. Despite feeling depressed and nihilistic, some part of us still wants to fight. I'm not sure what it really is, but if you've ever played a sport, you might know what I mean. Or even if you've been super low in your life, there might have been a point where something just clicks and you want to do more. And so in this moment, Mori, instead of letting go or slowly coming down, he jumps. As little likelihood as there was of him actually making it onto the overhang, he does it. It is luck to some degree, but it's also just that little fire that gets lit right there. As soon as Mori jumps and he feels that feeling of taking that big risk where his entire life changes. There's a part in the manga towards the end where he even reflects back on this moment of when he jumps from the wall onto the overhang, and that's kind of where everything started. Because of this little miraculous small step, he falls in love with climbing. And because of this, he kind of escapes depression, or to some degree, it's a lot different than what you might think. This is the beginning of Mori Buntarou's true journey. And this, I feel like, illustrates so many beautiful things in our lives that we kind of just take for granted. It does take a lot of time, but eventually he slowly starts to fall in love, and it was kickstarted all by this one moment. He begins to open up more as a person and truly change, especially through climbing different mountains. And it's really ironic how the more he climbs to the peaks of different mountains that no one has really been to, the less isolated he becomes, when you think it would be the opposite of that. A really interesting paradox that is implemented into this beautiful story. If I was to summarize it, I'd say Mori's life and the climber in general is peak. Get it? Because like the mountain peak. In the beginning, Mori desperately tries to climb by himself, rejecting pretty much everyone as he has, but as time goes on, he gets a few rope partners, he becomes more warm to people, and he kind of starts making a few friends, while paradoxically becoming more lonely because, again, he's the only one to climb certain peaks. To sum up this section of the video, I'd like to say that loneliness disappears when you pursue something that means almost everything to you. It could be one thing or it could be many, but sacrificing time and life into that passion ironically gives you more life and time in return. If I was to have a message with this video, that's what it would be. Now let's get into talking more about the manga and its themes and why I love this story so much. Probably the thing I enjoyed most about The Climber was the symbolism and how it was expressed through the stunning artwork. As every panel after the 100th chapter was damn near perfect, I would go as far as to say The Climber has some of the most beautiful spreads I've ever seen, and trust me, I've read some pretty freaking good manga with some of the best artists that we know. But what made the panels and characters so much more real to me, and what added an entirely new layer to the already phenomenal artwork, was the symbolism. Again, I've said this, probably this is the third time I've said in the video, the symbolism of The Climber is the best you will see in manga. What immediately comes to mind is the connection between mountains and loneliness. Think about it. Mori always wanted to climb alone and without a rope. The rope is not only what saves you from falling, but it's a physical connection to your climbing partners. It seemed like the more Mori used the rope and climbed with others, the more dissatisfied he was, and the further he was from the peaks. When he climbs with people, he doesn't usually get to the peak. So what's interesting is the more Mori climbs, the more isolated he becomes, but also the bigger of a name he becomes because he's the first person to climb up these gigantic mountains. But at the same time, he still kind of feels lonely, like there's something missing, until he truly achieves his main goal, because he's after a main goal. That main goal is what satisfies what's inside him. So many things happen later. I keep getting so close to getting into spoilers. You just need to give this manga a read to truly understand what I'm talking about, with the symbolism of the ropes, the mountains. The dialogue that Mori has is very similar to characters like Guts and Musashi. And that's probably why I have him somewhere in my top 3 protagonists. So think about that. That's a pretty high standard to achieve. It's a manga that you might think starts off a little slowly. There are some moments where, yes, it's a little slow, it's a little average, but after the first even like 20 chapters, I would go as far as to say the manga becomes incredible. It's kind of like Goodnight Punpun without the extreme amounts of depression, plus Vagabond with the type of character Musashi is and the type of goal he has combined together, and you add an element of like rock climbing and mountain climbing, and this is the manga you have. I don't think you'd consider it a sports manga because Mori doesn't competitively climb, but it's nonetheless phenomenal. Now, if I was to give one criticism, as I mentioned previously in the video, it's that some of the pacing moments are a little bit weird. There are some times where I feel like a lot of moments could have been fleshed out a little bit better. The ending was one of my favorite endings ever, but I would have liked to see some of the reactions of the other characters. To be fair, some of my other favorite endings like Monster doesn't quite do that. So I will give it the pass on that, but I will say some moments were rushed a little bit. Some things weren't clarified the best, though I suppose that if you look more into the symbolism, you could understand it a little bit better. The Climber has potential to be even as close as to like my favorite manga, if not for like some of the criticisms here. I mean, it just does pretty much everything perfectly, and I would definitely say that it is without a doubt worth the read. If you've experienced loneliness at any point in your life, or if you're going through it now, this story will impact you very heavily. I also feel like Mori is a lot more relatable than characters in other stories that deal with loneliness, like Punpun, for example. Punpun to me is an example of extremely depressing situations that happen in life and dealing with those, whereas Mori's kind of the character where I feel like dealing with loneliness comes from the pursuit of something a lot greater. If you set a very high goal for yourself, a peak on a mountain, so to speak, then your life will be centered around that peak, and that emptiness will be filled up with your passion for that dream.